I'm Stefan. I pretty much started as a kid doing videos and stop motion, got interested into stuff. Then I got introduced into Blender. So I started out testing stuff in 3D. Back then, Blender even had a game engine. So I looked around, made some tests, did some, I guess, mini games. Even played around with the Warcraft 3 editor, Unreal Dev Kit, stuff like that. At a certain point, though, I wanted like a video cam, and from that on, I wanted to study motion pictures. So pretty much, I can figure out why my home videos looked so bad. At that point, after my motion picture studies, I went to apply to Crytek, which I was there for like 6.5 years. And now I started a self-employment journey, basically. So I started my own little studio. So here are some examples of the time at Crytek. That goes through fine. Video's lagging a bit. Okay, hopefully that's okay later on. So this presentation will cover a few broad topics and basic concepts, partly in the context of 3D animation and also game cinematics. So today's topic is what makes it cinematic? The art of visual storytelling. So we're going to explore how visual components and intentional choices shape a cinematic story. So let's start by figuring out what cinematic even means, because it's a term that's been thrown around. It means something different for everyone, I feel. I had a class, I think 2 years ago, where I asked the students, and they would tell me different things. They would write on the down, it means it's 24 FPS. There's a specific aspect ratio to it. There's color grading a lot that makes everything just cinematic. Then some just refer to it as the professional film look. Some just said, yeah, it's style, it's aesthetics, a trend that kind of just looks cool. It also has to do with expensive gear, I suppose, dynamic range, maybe even the VFX. Some said it's cool stuff like the lens flare, something that looks interesting. And those answers are not wrong, but they don't make it very clear either, right? It just kind of feels like a movie. So I thought about gameplay and cinematic trailers as well. And even like the phone, for example, has like a cinematic mode. And basically what it does is just like gives your camera a shallow depth of field, even a fake one. And yeah, if there's like trailers for games, there's usually a gameplay trailer, and then there's often like a cinematic trailer, right? That just isn't the game probably. It's just like how it feels in high fidelity. There's also on YouTube, if you look it up, there's just like so many videos explaining what it means or what you would do to make a video cinematic. And even in pop culture nowadays, I feel like the absolute cinematic meme is making its round. So it all hits kind of some aspects of it. And the cinematic meme, for example, is kind of used when, for example, there's an underdog winning, you know, that kind of things. Or even like in Battlefield, if you go around, there's explosion happening left and right, and you just run by, and it just kind of hits in the perfect moments. And even in life, if like the timing, the action feels like being in a movie. So it really evolved over the years, I would say. Cinematic is in one word that changed and is interpreted differently. I found a cool quote from Neil Osman. Telling the story in the most visual appropriate way is the essence of cinema. So that kind of already describes it a bit where we're going here today. I won't be covering audio. It plays a huge role in audio in cinema and something feeling cinematic or being cinematic. But we will only focus on the visuals today. All right, let's look at it where it comes from. So as a language, we kind of have to talk about visual storytelling. It's been there forever, basically. So if we go back to time, this on the right side here is one of the very first paintings, kind of, that got delivered in from cavemen. So stories are there to transport ideas, emotions through space and time. So it's kind of like a human need to express themselves. And we express ourselves through language. It's a primary means by which humans convey meaning. And it usually contains something like grammar and vocabulary, right? So basic visual language evolved into cinematic language. And to understand the language, we need to understand its basic components, like all the vocabulary, all the grammar, all the rules and such. And if we understand the language, then we can tell stories. And as humans, we are pattern-seeking creatures. So we will find stories everywhere. Like everywhere we look, we will tell ourselves something about it. And we're pretty much attracted by emotions, motion, and contrast. That's just like where our attention is grabbed by. So one of the most common story, I would say, is the hero's journey. I mean, Joseph Campbell is the one that kind of wrote about it, but it's been there forever and it's been alternated over the times as well. It's kind of referred to as the monomyth, somewhat the story of life. It's like the archetypical story of growth, I would even say. So it's the story behind the story, kind of. And most stories follow that, the structure, even very loosely. So usually we just start at the known. Whatever is home, for example, we establish a world. So there everything is in order, basically. So we're gonna go this way around, and usually there's a call to adventure. There's an event or something, some sort of change that occurs that creates a need. Then usually some sort of mentor appears, but the hero doesn't feel ready yet. There's a refusal of the hero. Examples for mentors would be kind of like Obi-Wan Kenobi, Gandalf, whatever in pop culture. Then at a certain point, the hero crosses the threshold and they go into the unknown, into the chaos, basically, into the second world. So the journey kind of starts here, really. And sometimes it even like there's gonna be some bridges burned in the back, so you don't even like the hero can't go back anymore. So in the new world, the hero is faced with trials and failure. They often find allies along the way as well. And then they approach to the goal, to whatever was set up in the beginning to call to the adventure. So now they need to face themselves. Often that's the point of death and rebirth, because there's something within them, like a corruption, the fear they must face, a part of them, a flaw that must die to be reborn. And there's gonna be a revelation in the abyss, basically. It's kind of like when Neo dies, but then he's gonna be reborn and he realizes he's the one. That's kind of that moment. So the hero transforms and therefore can finish the quest, whatever they went through to go here. So there's gonna be a resolution, a reward, some sort of, like back in the days, what like a magic potion, for example. It can also be like wisdom or some item that can solve the final issue. So on the road back, often they get even chased, which leads to the resurrection. That's kind of the part where they showcase that they have truly changed in that moment here, and they can show that in the final showdown. And in the end, if they make it, they can return home. Usually they even benefit to the community. They bring home the gift, whatever was found, and now they're the master of the two worlds. So the whole thing, like if you go through, it's like a metamorphosis, right? It's like a change of the hero. It's a story of progression. There are pretty familiar patterns going on here. Like you could even say, you go from childhood to adulthood, or you could even say, this might be every day. You wake up in your bed, at your home, you go out to work, there's some death and rebirth happening. and then you go back to your home, and you're the master of the two worlds, basically, right? It could even be every task you do, because every task has this moment, the call to adventure. You have some refusal. You kind of don't want to do it, but you have to. You go through, and afterwards you feel like, okay, actually, it's good that I did it. So it's a story of change and of overcoming obstacles, I would say. Next up, we're going to cover some of the basic visual components. They will be pretty much based on this book, The Visual Story from Bruce Block. I can only recommend it. I think it should be linked here as well when this PDF gets sent, or like this presentation gets sent. And this is pretty much based on that. It's broken down, it's simplified. Therefore, like, aspects are missing. It's sometimes even only scratching at the surface. But I highly recommend the book if you're interested. So overall, the visual components provide the foundation for the cinematic language to convey ideas and emotions. It's kind of, in some sense, it's the structure. It's if language needs vocabulary and grammar, this is kind of it, I feel. So we're going to go through. It starts with space, basically, but I'm going to talk about contrast and affinity first, because that's kind of like the concept that is where everything relies on, really. So contrast and affinity, they're basically the two main roles we have here. Contrast stands for the greater visual intensity, and affinity is like less visual intensity. It's more, so contrast means more different, and change creates contrast. And affinity means similarity. So repeating something, staying the same, that creates affinity. Contrast and affinity can exist in visual components that we're going to cover in the next slides. And they can happen within the frame, from shot to shot, and through the whole creation. So that's very important to keep in mind. To create visual progression, we're going to use every component, which will help you to tell your story. So just as a very simplified graph here, usually, left to right goes through time, up and down to up goes to the intensity. That's kind of like your basic story arc. And we will learn now how some of those, or like all of those visual components can help you with that story, to tell that story with contrast and affinity. So the first visual component we're going to cover is space. It's pretty much defining the dimensional perception of the screen, because everything we see is just 2D, right? Even if we're like in a game or in a movie and everything feels like 3D at the end, we're just watching it on a screen right now, at least. So we have pretty much flat to deep space. So these are like the extremes we can go. And flat space often created through affinity. And the deep space is usually more contrast through depth cues. So at the bottom here, for example, we see we don't have a lot of depth cues. Everything is kind of the samey. They all have the same tone. The trees, they might be overlapping, but we don't really see. We don't know if the birds are like in the back on the same plane or not. And those are the cues to identify something is flat or deep. And here in the deep space, we can see we have a lot of perspective. There's a size difference. There's also a tonal difference here, an overlap. So this gets overlapped with the back here. And sometimes you can even have like focus. If something in the front is in focus and the back is blurry, that's more of a deep space cue. So next up would be, there's also a bigger space. So it is kind of like this disorientating, unclear, hard to understand. Like if you see it first, you don't know exactly where you are. Sometimes that can happen because of the unusual camera angle. Maybe you're looking at the reflection and that gets only revealed later on. Or the tonal pattern is just confusing, as in this example as well. Like you're not quite sure where's up, where's down. It's an unknown object. But you can reveal that if you, for example, now introduce a character that just would appear, and then often the brain kind of gets into the point to understand, okay, that's a familiar object. I can now see how it fits in. So usually staying in one space of type, then from shot to shot, you will create affinity. So if you only stay in deep space the whole time, throughout your sequence, for example, it will become affinity. But if you change the space, you will create more contrast and therefore more visual intensity. There are more aspects to space. For example, here, this is like a quite nice example, I think, for surface division. You can divide characters quite easily. It's kind of clear what's happening. It's two people that are disconnected from each other. There's something in between them, like literally. Then we have this guy who, well, it's a frame within a frame. And I mean, there's not much explanation needed. You can pretty much tell right away what it's meant to portray here. Which leads us to line and shape. So lines are pretty much everywhere, right? Like everything consists of lines. They form shapes. So these basic shapes would be like circles, squares, triangles, and you can break everything down. So those are like the very primary visual structure of any image, really, of any visual. And you can create contrast and affinity through them as well, through either like orientation, diagonal lines. They create more contrast than, for example, flat lines. It's just like more high visual intensity. The direction, for example, of moving objects, if everything goes the same way, it's kind of affinity. But if you have things going different ways, you create contrast, right? Also, the quality is important here. The quality in that sense means what kind of line it is, for example. If it's curved, if it's a wiggly line, that gets more complex and therefore as well has more visual intensity. A straight line would be kind of a low visual intensity. So then I have a short example. Hopefully this plays. Yeah. So yeah, you can see it, right? Yeah, cool. So here we have like very clear tools of like showing lines. We lead the lines to the character as well. Also, the eye level here is kind of important as well. He's above everyone else. He's the center of things. Everyone is playing after him. He's like the central role. All right, let's talk about tone. So tone is one of the easier visual components, I would say, to understand, really. It uses, for example, you can control it with your exposure value, with lights, with volumetrics and materials to control the tone. It's pretty much really just saying what the brightness of an object is. So in this example here, we have like a gray sphere, right? We can see here on the left side on this image, everything is kind of bright, then it gets darker. We get some contrast here because it's different, right? We direct the attention and create form. Like, that's also where we look, right? We look at the shape of this thing, at the surrounding. Like here, for example, where there's nothing, there's just affinity, and here's contrast of tone. So this is where we look also. And when we now darken the right side, for example, we can see we introduce affinity because now we don't have a lot of contrast on the side anymore because the dark values of the sphere and darkness of the background, they kind of start to merge, right? So if we turn around the sphere, so it's now on the bright side, like we change lighting, for example, or change the material, like it's up to us, we create the contrast again, right? Like this is more contrast now as well because it's on the dark side to the bright, and this is bright to the dark. So we have a tonal contrast. Next up would be color. So color is kind of like a really complicated topic. Like it's really a sophisticated emotional tool. Like everybody has a different understanding as well, or background, like how they see color, what it means to them. There's a lot of psychology response in them as well. Overall, they are controlled by 3 values: it's hue, brightness, and saturation. So with that, you can make up every color, really. What's important is also how colors are received differently based on context. So one color to the other might have a different effect than two different colors. For example, blue and pink, they respond differently to each other than green and blue. And it's important, like throughout your story, whatever you're telling or doing visually, that you define what the color means in your context of your story. I don't think there's like a general thing you could say about colors. There might be like, stronger colors, like red, for example. But I'm not the biggest fan of just like going into stereotypes of what a specific color can mean. So there are many ways to create contrast and infinity with colors, just mixing them in some sense. And there's a lot of options, but usually if you look at movies, for example, they kind of keep it simple. They limit the color palette. They sometimes play with the opposites and such, but often you can see they don't go, too crazy on things. There are obviously examples where they do, and they have a lot of meaning within those examples. But often you can see something like this, where you have like a barcode kind of visualization of how color evolves through a movie. And that can tell you a lot about storytelling as well, of like, this is Bambi, how the color starts out, where it's heading, and where it has different dips, like where it creates different emotions throughout. Next up would be rhythm. So rhythm is very important visual component of, and it's not the not the rhythm in music, for example. It's really just a visual rhythm on where elements sit in your frame. So the important subcomponents of rhythm are alternation. So that's kind of like a change of element. Then you have the repetition, which is needed to create an ongoing beat, for example. And you have the tempo, which defines how fast the rhythm is, how close visual elements are to each other, for example. And with rhythm as well as all the other visual components, you can create contrast and affinity. This one through the slow and fast tempo, and through regular and irregular rhythm. So again, here, shot like within a frame, shot by shot, and throughout the sequence, if you always keep to the same rhythm, like where elements sit in the frames, it's going to be affinity. If you change up the rhythm, it's got to be more contrast. So here, for example, we have a pretty simple rhythm, right? It's like nothing. Then we have a beat, basically, like we have a alternation, a change of element, and then we go to nothing. So it's like A, B, and A, for example. This one is a little bit more complicated, I would say. A little bit more contrast. It's like a more interesting beat. There's more space on the left. Then we have kind of like an element sitting here, and then we have less space on the right. And this is even more extreme example where we not only have these two, there's faster tempo, there's more elements creating more complex rhythm, and therefore is visually more intense than the other examples. All right, let's go forward to movement. So movement really is the primary mechanism for guiding the viewer's attention. Whenever something moves, we look at it right away. It can be created by virtually moving objects, the camera, or the audience's points of attention. So whatever like changes across frame, they generate movement. So the pixels basically, they change color, right? Like there's no actual movement happening. It's apparent movement. It's movement from through. So changing any of the elements creates contrast. So if we want contrast or affinity in movement, we kind of want to control the direction, the quality, and the speed. So the direction, for example, you go with a diagonal movement, that is kind of like the most intense one, right? Compared to like a horizontal one or vertical one. If you go for the quality, you can define the trajectory, if it's like a curved or straight movement. And for the speed as well, if everything moves the same speed, affinity is produced. But if objects move at different speeds, contrast and therefore visual intensity is created. So whenever you change things up, basically. So with this example here, just to illustrate, it's just a bunch of pictures. Okay, just checking the chat. I think some people having issues, but it's working fine for most, I hope. It's getting recorded either way, so you can check the visuals later on, probably. Okay, so you can see here, well, it's just picture after picture, right? The motion, yeah, you can kind of guess, but if you go with a faster frame rate, it can create the illusion of motion. So this is just the same thing, just quicker, and you can see we kind of interpret it as movement. Here as well, even with objects that are not even, they're not even moving here. It's just stacking up coins. Like the coins are not moving. It's just picture per picture. It's created something different, and therefore creates that apparent movement. So these were all the components. Next up, we're gonna quickly talk about the virtual camera, because it plays a big role in cinematics, animating. I think I need to close down Discord here for a second. Okay, so to control the contrast and affinity through camera movement. So the camera pretty much defines where we're looking, right? You're controlling the eyes, what the audience sees, and therefore pretty much define what visual components we're looking at. So we usually capture 2D images of a 3D space. And in animation and VFX, that would be the layout artist, for example, that controls the camera. In games, you either cut to different cameras, override the camera animation, or direct the cinematic sequence around the player, which is kind of like the hardest to do, I guess. And moving the camera creates visual intensity, right? But only moving the camera, so moving the camera creates visual intensity, but if you only move the camera like the whole time, it's kind of getting affinity, right? But if you then change it up, so for example, you have a sequence where you move it the whole time, and then at the end you go for no movement for the camera at all, it creates visual interest, like it creates contrast again. So, and then there's like some tips here, or like some talk about animating a virtual camera. So the cool thing about 3D space is you can place it anywhere, really, like, which also makes it a bit harder because it doesn't mean it needs to be, right? Like you can overthink stuff quite easily. So it usually helps to ground the virtual camera in reality for believability. Like often it helps to think like, if there was a person controlling the camera, how would they do it? How would they act? You can add like the realism on top, like the realistic imperfections of like shake, sway, and the tiny unwanted things you usually don't want in, but they ground the whole thing. So any real world data you can capture there can help quite a bit. Also like imperfections like a shot reaction delay also helps, because if the camera already kind of knows what's gonna happen, you can tell that, right? But if you're like in the moment, you have a little bit of delay, it can really help you get things across realistically. So then like a general point of like, if you keep the exposure value fixed at one like a static value, That's usually what they do in the movies, right? But if you have it dynamic, it would give you this found footage effect of like more of an amateur kind of phone recorded video. And just a little reminder here, in case you're starting out, please grab the handles. It's kind of just to say, if you animate your first cameras and you don't touch any of the interpolation, how it's being translated in 3D space, the animation will look odd because you're gonna have a smoothing of like, you start slow, you go fast, and you end slow, which often looks very, very cheap. But it can be a desired effect if you want to, but you should do it knowingly and not by accident. Cool. Next up would be lighting. So, obvious thing, you can't see without light. Wow, that's new. But really, light is very nice. Like, it's reveals information whenever and wherever you want, right? Like, it's really your best friend to have. You can have practical and believable light sources in the scene. They will ground it. So, for example, you see in the frame there's a window, then you have a reason to put a really strong light kind of over there, or even push it further. But it helps to ground it in the scene, to have something to be convincing of that there's a light coming from. So it's really one of the most powerful tools you have, because with the lighting you can control most aspects of the visual components we just talked about. You can show lines, shapes, you can control the tone. There's a lot of color involved as well if you want to, all those things. And in any 3D software, lights, again, like cameras, they can be anywhere, right? Any size. There's no limit to like whatever softbox you would have in real life. There's no limit to that. And you can easily animate them, like in position, rotation, color, intensity. You can have them flicker how you like. It's also great to have invisible flags, so to introduce shadows where you want shadows to happen, and also have reflectors wherever needed. And you can, for example, exclude them from your render pass. But it really helps you if you want specific lights anywhere, you can just add them. And if needed, for characters, for example, for anything really, you can attach, link, or parent the lights. It can look artificial though, like if you overdo it, it can look really fake, but it's a nice option to have, really. Then there's a quote from Gregory Maguire: "The eye is always caught by light, but shadows have more to say." So that really says, like, you know, that the mind fills in the void. So usually if you have something too lit up, it kind of loses the interest, right? It loses the contrast. It's getting into affinity. If the tone overall is the same, it kind of gets boring, right? So often what happens in any cinematic video, sort of say, would be to shoot on the dark side of subjects or objects. So if a character, for example, you would have the simple 3-point light setup would be to have a key, a fill, and a backlight. So the key would be a strong light. You would want to place the camera probably on the dark side, so there's more shadows on this side of the face. You can have a little bit of a fill that helps you fill up some of that dark space, so it's not completely dark. And then in the back you can have a light, a rim light, so to say, to help highlight the contours, the silhouette, the edges, the hair, and such. But as a lot of things, it's really easy to overdo. Like, less can be more. Like, don't overthink it. It's a single well-positioned light source can be more effective than like 20 small lights scattered across the whole scene. because they're also really hard to control, to manage. If you want to change something, it's really difficult. But yeah, less can be more. So let's go through some of the examples I have here. So this would be kind of like a 3-point setup, I suppose. You have a key light over here that also gives you some nice eye reflections. You want them, really. That makes your character alive. You even get like a small little triangle here. It's quite harsh. The shadow is really, there's a line here. It's not really soft. But you have some fill light over here, so there's still detail in the dark areas here, in the shadows. So that's kind of nice. And you have the classic, the rim light, which kind of gives you this edge here. It separates the character from the background and makes it pop just a little bit more. But also, light is really great for storytelling, right? Like if you want to really literally shine a spotlight on someone, you can just easily do that and separate them completely if you want to. You can also have people look into the light or looking for the light in the dark. So that tells also a lot of things, right? And even get those nice details in the back. But again, the eyes are really important. We, as humans, always gonna look for the eyes. We're gonna that's like a visual interest for us. Then you have an example here where she's looking away from the light, right? So that's also a lot of storytelling going on here. Like there's a harsh light coming in, but she's looking away. And if you know the story, it kind of makes sense, right? So it's introducing a lot of cool features here. And then you have Bane, who's kind of like, you think darkness is your ally, but you merely adopted the dark. I was born in it, molded by it. I didn't see the light until I was a man, but by then it was nothing to me but blinding. So you kind of get this classical top light, very dark eyes though. It's very harsh, very bright. And he's stepping like out of the darkness into the spotlight. You can also have light almost like a comedic effect, like frontal light, for example. So it's kind of like a revealing effect, as you can have your object looking at something. So it's very interesting to see they're looking into the light. And then you can also use it quite the opposite, where you just have the light in the back. You almost get no fill here in this example. You just get a little bit here of the light from the back hitting onto some, so you get some detail here in the face, but just only tiny bit, and the rest is just purely silhouette. And the last example would be the underneath light. It's very weird. It's kind of like unfamiliar because we are usually seeing things from more of a top light. You know, during daytime, you get the skylight, so everything is lit more from above than underneath. And once you flip that around, it kind of gets scary. So next up would be some common practices and rules. Those are just some generic ones from either film, editing tricks, and some wisdom, I suppose. So starting with the 180-degree rule. So that's a common thing that can happen if you have two objects, or like two subjects, or like two people talking to each other. They're facing each other, and you want to film them from both angles. You don't want to cross that line between them. Because if you use this camera here, you're gonna have the subject over there on the right side and this one on the left side. And the same happens if you use this camera, right? They're still, this person is on the right side and this person is on the left side. If you go on the other side of that line, it kind of switches and it gets confusing easily because suddenly they're in the same space within the frame. So you kind of want to avoid that usually. You can break the rule if you want to. You can also have the camera go past. So if you physically, like within the shot, go past that line, it makes the audience understand what's happening. But usually you want things to be understandable. So you want to keep it on one side of things. Otherwise you can have, people running left to right, next shot they're running right to left. It's very confusing. So just I think this video as well, as an editing trick, it makes sense to cut on the action. So it's like where the most interesting thing happens, the most action, you color it, it makes your cut more seamless. And you can also control the point of attention across cuts. So in Mad Max, for example, they did everything really center framed because they had a lot of action, a lot of quick cuts. And that makes sense if the point of interest you're looking on the screen is kind of in the same area. Otherwise, your eyes have to jump around a lot, and that is exhausting for the audience. And some wisdom here on the side. Every shot needs a purpose. So that's a usual thing for like a sequence. There's a saying like, kill your darlings. So even if you worked really hard on a shot, you kind of want to have it in, but sometimes the shot just doesn't work in the whole edit. So you have to be really cruel to yourself sometimes to eliminate those shots you kind of like, but if they don't fit in, you have to leave them out. Next up would be show, don't tell. Like, that's rather simple. Often you can say things not just in dialogue or simple text, but you use the visual language to transport the information. And if you have every element aligned with your story, you're gonna be good. It's gonna look cinematic. There's a magic number, which is 3, which is kind of like a smallest pattern, I suppose. It's kind of like a setup. So one is the setup, the second would be establishing the pattern, and the third is a payoff, a twist, a sort of change of things. So it's a simple thing to introduce, even if you're doing some effects or something within your video, for example. You kind of want to have it 3 times at least, otherwise it's it feels a bit odd. And then up there I included also some composition grids. So composition grids can be really helpful to create structure and a natural balance between things within the frame. And there's a lot of different guides here. The classic one is the rule of thirds, or like the golden ratio, and it can help to align objects more balanced, more natural within your frame. All right, just checking if I forgot something here. Cool. Then, yeah, just a quick summary. I think we're also quite good with time now, which is cool. So I would say, as mentioned, like when all elements, if they work together, that makes it cinematic. That's kind of like the point here. With all the elements that you have, all the components, if they work together, it just makes it cinematic. Lead them how you like. I mean, you can control them through all the components, right? But you have to make it yours. Like, you have to invent your own style with them, give them meaning, and attach them. Like, I like to think of the visual components sort of like a team, like companions that go through that story and help you tell that story, right? Each of them got their own journey, specialties, characteristics, and so forth. But if you combine them all, align them to tell the stories, it can make it work. And there are some useful archetypes that let the audience understand you easily, but it can also result in boring stereotypes, right? Like, as I mentioned with the color, if you just use the common color for the common reason why you would use it, it can be quite on the nose. And yeah, usually what you want to create here is visual components that go through the journey as well and help and support the story arc. So here we have the graph again, showing the intensity and the time and the story arc, which is the green one. But now, for example, if we take one of the visual components, let's say tone, and say, okay, we kind of want affinity at the start, then we go up to contrast throughout the sequences, throughout the shots. At a certain point, maybe it should have more affinity again, so we drop down, and then we can introduce more contrast again. So there's some sort of visual progression going on. And ideally, it aligns with your storytelling, right? So what you want to say with it. You can then, for example, do the same thing with the camera movement. You can say, hey, at the beginning, I want more of a dolly, so a lot of movement introduced, and then at the end, we don't want any. So that's kind of like a visual progression throughout the whole piece. And those, like visualizing that in craft can really help a lot during planning and production to ensure that the visual progression is working. And yeah, you define what certain elements mean in your project, in your story. And it also makes sense to have like not everything in one craft, but rather also split it up, because you have elements like in the color with hue, where you can say, okay, at the beginning we wanted more of a cool tone. At a certain point in the story there might be a change where it makes sense to say, hey, now we're gonna switch to warm colors. But in the end, here something happens again, so we end up with a more balanced hue. Cool. I think that's me. Thank you for your attention. And next up would be Q&A. All right. So Haley, you have a question. Thanks for the talk. Cool. Thanks. How do you balance creative ideas with constraints like budget and production timelines? Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, that's always that's always the issue, right? Like there's enough creative ideas. The resource of time and budget is the issue to realize things. I think like proper planning is the key here, right? You need to understand what you're able to produce, or your team. Come up with ideas how to tell a story, maybe even without showing a lot. You can tell stories in, very limited ways. Like don't tell but show. And I think that way you can maybe get across more than your budget would usually allow. Like even if you just go for extreme close-ups for some things, just show the detail. You don't need to show the whole thing. It can actually create more, right? Like if you introduce detail in only a few parts and it looks very detailed, then the mind kind of thinks that's detailed across the whole thing. So you can get away with less than you think. Thank you very much. Do you have a go-to pattern balancing and planning the rules you just elaborated to? From Dennis Menas. Balancing. So I think go-to pattern, I mean, if we want to balance things, I mean, for planning, it makes sense to have the graphs. Like whenever you have a script, an idea, you have a goal in mind for your video or for your product, it makes sense to write down or like to visualize the graphs. Think about the elements you want to control that are the most important for your story, and then plan them out through the graphs. And once you, for example, do your storyboards, you can easily always look back on like, okay, for example, in this sequence, I really wanted more deep space to happen, so we get that visual intensity. Or you want more affinity in that other part because you want to convey that feeling. So I think in those regards, having those graphs usually help me to plan things out quite early. Hope that answers that. I am Melv asks, what are the movies that you think of immediately when talking about good visual storytelling, besides the ones you had as an example in your presentation? I mean, It happens everywhere, kind of, right? I mean, there's a few, I guess, more kind of like pushing more into the artistic kind of style side. I mean, it really depends on what you prefer. I mean, for me, I guess I really like. I mean, even like the Pixar movies, they have great usage of color, of because if you animate things, you kind of really have to take care of each shot, right? So they do like a really good job of that, I feel. But also, if you look at the Nolan movie, I mean, it also comes down to the cinematographer the directors are working with, because they mostly decide on the picture, right, on the image. But I can also in the sources have a few examples if you would like to. But it comes down to style and preference, I think. There's not like something across for everyone, yeah. Yaroslav Saitsev asks, thanks, very cool looking presentation. There's one question that bothers me, and none of my colleagues were able to answer it. Is there really any difference between rule of thirds and golden ratio when applied to cinematic composition? On my experience, everything golden ratio related can be explained within rule of thirds, but I feel like I missed something here. So yeah, there is a difference. If you can I write on this? It's gonna be a bit chunky. Okay, let's do this. So rule of thirds would be very evenly distributed pattern. So all of them are the same size, right? So that's just the perfectly into the thirds, right? And what happens, I guess it makes also sense to go back where I have it here. And what happens with the golden grid, like the golden rule, it's like the golden ratio, and it's kind of like applied here, I guess, in the sense that you take this line here, right, and also have it happen on the other side. So it's a bit closer to the middle. And then if you take the other lines here as well, you get more space. Like this is a bigger square, and like these are the same sizes, but the others are not, right? It's a more organic ratio, I would say, based on the golden ratio. Oops, I think I closed something. Thank you very much. Great presentation. Do you see any key differences between the game and film industry when it comes to how they approach storytelling? I mean, storytelling always kind of evolves in some sense, right? There's always more stories to tell. There is sort of this monomyth of like this very meta story, I would say. So I think the meta story you can find everywhere, really. So I think in that regard, the story is not much different, but it's how it's getting there. So film is usually just passive, right? But games are quite active. Like you want the players to create their own stories. You usually don't want to give them everything, because that's the fun of games. You kind of experience them in your own terms. You kind of go with your own pace. So I think in that regard, it's very much different. But the overarching meta story, I think, still stays true. Yeah, if that makes sense. But yeah, for games, you always have to think about the player. What the player will do, how they will go through things, and direct it that way, with the player in mind first. Cool, thank you so much. Enjoy the evening, or whatever time it is at your place, and see you around for the next one.